How are we doing? Real rain, a little San Francisco outside. Right to my fan, he's shaving. I'm saying like comedy. I don't want to bring up comedy today. I'm like, anymore. So I'm so excited that you're here. I'm Lyndon Gill, Associate Professor of African Diaspora Studies, also in the Department of Anthropology and at the Center. The Center for Women's and Gender Studies. Thank you. I appreciate that. This thing still feels it feels old now, but it just happened. It just happened. And I have the distinct pleasure of curating this year's Diaspora Talk lecture series, generously supported by the John L.Warfield Center for African and African American Studies. For the fall semester, for some of you who were here for our talk with Cindy Elizabeth, a beautiful opening that we had. Our theme is the Afro-Local ATX, Gathering Austin's African Diaspora. And so although Austin prides itself on supporting and celebrating any and everything local, this locavore obsession has often meant eating local, shopping local, and playing local, but this support of local business has not often meant an equal support and celebration of local blackness. Inspired by the locavore movement, but also by a deeply rooted love for global communities of African descent, which have been locavore for centuries, this semester's theme turns our attention to the Black brilliance blossoming here in our own front yard. While honoring the long legacy of born and bred Black Austinites, like Ms. Lang, we also will feature the scholarship and artistry of those of us who now call Austin home, some of us were Caribbean people. It is my hope that we can cultivate a global conversation about Blackness while grounded right here at ATX. This fall, we are reaping the rewards of the Black bounty that we all share. This series could not be possible without the hard work and long patience of Ms. Stephanie Lang, the program coordinator at the Warfield Center, and Ms. Justice Madden, who wears very many hats. This is the most stylish the Warfield Center has ever been. Thank you for that. The administrative associate at the center, just as his title. And I would be remiss not to thank Dr. Mika Makalani, the director of the center, and Dr. Jennifer Wilkes, both here, the associate director, for allowing me this opportunity. So thank you both. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I want to encourage you to continue the conversation with us. We have one last remaining lecture, so don't miss it. To close our series this semester on November 28th, in the same room, at the same time, we'll have Dr. Tammy Rubin, who's a ceramic sculptor and assistant professor of art in the Department of Visual Studies at St. Edward's University. So come on back to see Dr. Tammy. So we have a very exciting series. But without further ado, let me introduce our special guests for tonight. Dr. Theodore Francis is an assistant professor of history in the Department of Humanities and Fine Arts at Huston-Tillotson University, the first institution of higher education here. Leading the way for all the rest of us, a graduate of Morehouse College, no, he's no joke. He received his MA and PhD in Caribbean Atlantic World History from the University of Chicago, also no joke. Dr. Francis is currently completing his manuscript Insurgent Itineraries, Bermuda, Black Tourism, and Desegregation in the Age of Jim Crow, which explores the role of African American tourists and Black tourism in the process of desegregating the British Caribbean island of Bermuda. His talk title today is Sun, Sand, and Civil Rights, the Politics of Black Tourism in the Segregated Colony of Bermuda. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Francis.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
I just want to thank everyone here at the Warfield Center. I want to thank Professor Gill for inviting me. I want to thank all the staff and other faculty who are responsible for putting this lecture series together. Thank you for considering me. And without any further ado, I'd just like to jump into this talk that I have prepared. Actually one thing here. Since this is the African Diaspora Studies, yes? Hopefully we can bear a little bit of reference and bear a little bit consideration for some African diaspora traditions and concepts. We're ancestrally aware. We should, as people of African descent, at least in my part, where I came from, the island of Bermuda. And this project that I'm working on currently, my manuscript, was heavily influenced by a number of interviews that I did with a number of elders in Bermuda, and a few of them passed. So just a quick moment of reverence for the interview I'm on. Thank you. In July 1951, Althea Gibson and a group of African American players from the ATA, American Tennis Association, visited Bermuda to play in an international tournament hosted by the Summers Island Lawn Tennis Association. This was a black Bermudian tennis organization which had been formed near the turn of the century. Gibson headlined the event, which lasted from Thursday, July 10th to Sunday, July 13th, playing exhibition matches while Bermudians competed with ATA players for various titles and prize monies. Hilton Hill, a black Bermudian travel agent, arranged the itinerary for Gibson and her African-American colleagues, booking the group at the Imperial, a black-owned hotel in the city of Hamilton, and scheduling an array of activities, including special dinners, a beach party, a moonlight cruise, as well as drinks and dancing with luminaries from the island's black middle and upper classes. The tournament was a resounding success as thousands of black Bermudian spectators flocked to the stadium to witness this new American tennis ace. After the tournament, Gibson remained in the island for a brief vacation. However, she wanted to maintain her training routine while on holiday. Gibson asked Mr. Russell Dismont, a member of Summers Island Lawn Tennis Association's governing board, to make arrangements for her to play tennis at the tennis stadium. However, unbeknownst to her, segregation complicated her request. You see, the government tennis stadium was the island's largest multi-court tennis arena, built with public funds during the mid-1930s. The government considered the stadium as part of the colony's tourist infrastructure because many tourists enjoyed playing tennis, but most small hotels lacked courts. Therefore, the colonial government placed the stadium under the authority of the Trade Development Board, the government agency that supervised and regulated the island's tourist businesses. In turn, the board authorized the Bermuda Lawn Tennis Club, a segregated club for whites only, to manage the stadium's daily affairs. Consequently, blacks were only allowed to use the stadium for a prearranged 2-week period once a year, for which they had to pay a rental fee. Other than this brief period, blacks were forbidden from using the stadium. And if they wished to use the courts outside of their allotted 2-week period, they were required to request permission from the Bermuda Lawn Tennis Club or the Trade Development Board. Therefore, the difficulty of Gibson's request was apparent to her black Bermudian hosts, because their 2-week allotment had been spent preparing for and hosting the tournament, and now they had to ask special permission. However, Dismont was undaunted, and he called and obtained permission for Gibson to practice at the stadium for 3 separate training occasions, and the Bermuda Lawn Tennis Club agreed. However, they stipulated that Gibson must play with another tourist. In keeping with the Bermuda Lawn Tennis Club's instructions, Dismont arranged for an African-American tourist by the name of Lyra Johnson to practice with Gibson. For each of these practices, Gibson was accompanied by Lyra Johnson and 2 black Bermudians, Russell Dismont, as well as club president W.E.R. Joe. Gibson played with Johnson until she was thoroughly fatigued, and then either Joe or Dismont would hop in as needed. Unfortunately, each and every one of these practice sessions were marred by racism, as Gibson and the group were subjected to a variety of abuse from white onlookers. The group of black players stood out in stark relief against the stadium's typical white patrons, prompting spontaneous policing of the color line by white players and spectators. During one of these confrontations, after enduring the racial epithets and derogatory comments and noise disruptions from white players on adjacent courts, a white man approached the group and told them they had to leave because they're not tourists. When Desmond and Joe refused, explaining that they had received special permission from the Lawn Tennis Club to use the courts, the confrontation escalated into an argument that attracted a group of whites who joined the man in questioning their claims that did they really receive official permission? And they were very confused about whether or not Gibson and Johnson were really tourists. As the crowd of hostile white onlookers grew in size, Desmond and Joe relented, fearing police intervention, and ushered Gibson and Johnson out of the stadium. Although physically unharmed, Gibson was upset by the incident, despite the fact that Desmond and Joel and her other black Bermudian hosts apologized profusely, hoping to mitigate the negativity of her treatment before she returned to the U.S. a few days later. And while we do not have a record of their conversation, we can only imagine that her Bermudian hosts provided their African American guests with a local perspective on tourism, segregation, and race. The racial hostility experienced by Althea Gibson and her fellow African American tourists suggests that black leisure travelers had little chance of enjoying a Bermuda holiday without the indignities of racial discrimination. Similarly, the capacity of her Bermudian hosts to protect their guests, as well as themselves, from such treatment appears to be sorely lacking. Indeed, the careful cultivation of holiday itineraries by black travel agents could be deemed an exercise of irrelevancy if black tourists would be subjected to such indignities and black locals were unable to gain redress. Yet, as the historical record unfolded, these three constituencies, black Bermudians, African American tourists, and black tourism entrepreneurs, would play critical roles in the process of desegregation in the colony of Bermuda. Therefore, my talk, Sun Singing and Civil Rights, the politics of black tourism in the segregated colony of Bermuda, seeks to unpack the dynamics and politics of black-owned hospitality businesses within a British colonial setting that was largely inhospitable to blacks. In so doing, I hope that this paper will shed some light on the contours of segregation in Bermuda, help us to unpack the politics of black tourism, and look at the liberatory possibilities of black leisure travel in the era of the Cold War. That's Joe. In fact, I'm in kind of white suit standing next to you. Out there is Mr. Joe, who was actually involved in that confrontation with those other players at the tennis stadium. Regarding segregation, what I'd like to do is just kind of give you a little bit of overview on what segregation looks like in the colony, and then kind of backpack and look at, what these black entrepreneurs are doing in the island of Bermuda. Before, hopefully by the end of this, we maybe take a look and see what actually happens. What's the ultimate outcome of this confrontation between Althea Gibson and these whites at the tennis stadium? Regarding segregation in Bermuda, we need to realize this. The primary reason for segregation's existence and longevity in the colony of Bermuda was the political dominance of the colony's white elites. During slavery, black exclusion from the public sphere was commonplace, with churches, schools, and even graveyards segregated by race. Emancipation in 1834 failed to interrupt these practices because white islanders used the Local Emancipation Act to change the franchise laws in their favor. Yeah, they attached a rider onto the end of the Emancipation Act, but yeah. Voting and running for political office were restricted to landowners ever since the 17th century establishment of the colony's parliament or House of Assembly. At emancipation, white legislators doubled the value of real estate required to vote or stand as a candidate. And while these values were modified periodically, they were never repealed until the late 20th century. Consequently, by the 1950s, less than 14% of the island's 37 37,000 inhabitants were qualified to vote. That's roughly 5,000 people. And even though blacks comprised more than 60% of the overall population, the land-based franchise reduced their political power to less than 40% of the electorate. So even though whites were a numerical minority, they held political authority over the island due to the land-based voting and office voting system. So even though Bermuda did not enforce an island-wide policy of de jure segregation, its British Caribbean color line was facilitated by various commercial laws and that enabled private business owners to refuse service to individuals or to groups for practically any reason at all. Thus, white islanders were allowed to discriminate with little fear of legal penalty. The political foundation of segregation, as well as white ownership of the tourist industry, ensured that race would play a central role in the colony's social, economic, and political life for much of the 20th and into the 21st century. Given that fact, we need to just maybe reflect on a few scholars, and hopefully this might make a little bit of sense as we go through this. We have scholars such as Winston James, David Theo Goldberg, and Thomas Holt. They have reminded us that, of course, race is historical, right? And its manifestations change over time in relation to the political as well as the economic context of the space. As such, scholars define what Holt refers to as historically specific racisms, or what also Winston James refers to as the articulation of race. In other words, thinking about distinct expressions of racial discrimination situated within very precise geographical locations and defined by very clear time periods. And I know, we're right here at the University of Texas, so that theoretical tidbit is probably a small change from most of the big brains in the room, right? But it's relevant to Bermuda because the dynamics of race and racism were transformed as Bermuda's primary economic base transitioned from the dual sectors of export agriculture, Bermuda onions, and all of that, as well as maritime services in the 19th century. And it made that transition from agriculture and maritime services into the economic monoculture of tourism by the 20th and, of course, the 21st century. The rise of tourism included changes in the island's labor structure, as well as the racial stereotypes associated with certain occupations. What do I mean? So, for example, following emancipation, things like agriculture, planting tomatoes, planting onions, planting arrowroot, which was oftentimes used for starch, starch was one of the British uniforms. That was oftentimes considered Negro work or work for colors, due to the preponderance, of course, of black communities being involved in this concept of labor. However, by about the turn of the 20th century, when the tourist industry has taken hold and was beginning to expand to the point where agricultural jobs were declining, many blacks ended up losing their jobs in farming or lost their land to hotels. As a result, they became trapped into various other kinds of work, largely the hotel industries. Therefore, by about the period of World War I, agriculture is no longer being seen as Negro work. By this time, they've begun to import Portuguese as well as English contract workers, occupying a similar position to how the Indians used to occupy in colonies such as Trinidad and other spaces, Guyana and other spaces. In Bermuda, it was the Portuguese. Therefore, we're seeing a shift, and the labor which is now marked as Negro work is the jobs that are involved in tourist service, such as domestic service, cooks, carriage drivers, bellhops, doormen, etc. Also, on the other side of the color line, we're seeing corresponding changes with whites being marked for more visually prominent or so-called technically trained positions, such as wine stewards, maitre d's, chefs, front desk clerks, etc. More significant was the fact that whites were often owners and managers of hotels and tourist attractions. So when white Bermudian tourism promoters built hotels and leisure spaces in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they marketed Bermuda to a North American clientele that was often well-off and quite white. The efforts of Bermuda's tourism establishment to entice wealthy white North American elites to the island to enjoy its segregated resorts, facilitated the construction of one of the most enduring racial stereotypes related to Bermudian tourism. And that is the notion that the designation of tourist only applies to whites. Thus, this association between whiteness and the category of tourist meant that privileges of open access to hotels and related spaces of leisure were awarded or denied using the language of tourist as a proxy for race. Such a racial construction enabled white islanders, who were the numerical minority, to enjoy access to segregated hotels, beaches, golf clubs, and other leisure sites, while black islanders were barred from these sites unless moving through them as service bearers. This construction of race serves as the context for the incident at the tennis stadium, meaning that the borders of segregation in Bermuda were often defended using the language of tourist as proxy for white. Thus, the act of reserving certain spaces and places for tourists meant that they were unofficially white only. Therefore, the vigilant white onlookers at the tennis stadium that accosted Althea Gibson and her friends were simply employing the racial rubric encoded within decades of colonial tourist advertising, which reified by the discriminatory practices of most of the colony's hotels and tourist attractions. Just real quick little reflection here is just, this is an interesting image. I believe it might be in the east end of the island of Devonshire. It's of course this kind of a postcard cartoonism from around the turn of the century regarding black folks packing onions. That was the dominant stereotype in play. And it's also an interesting tension too. I was thinking about it after I used it too. I'm like, this is on a postcard. So it's also this kind of interesting nostalgia about what black folks were, you know, kind of like, I think it's Krista Thompson does some interesting work on, you know, the Caribbean and the use of the donkey in Jamaica and other spaces like that. It's kind of interesting trying to freeze blackness in time, even at a moment when most black folks ain't really doing it. But what's my point? My point is this kind of shift, this interesting transition from, of course, agricultural labor to the tourist dollar. And it's interesting because the very first image, of course, dog stands for fair people. Black folks just ain't even there. And I had a lot of fun in my dissertation, or really just hurt my head a lot, looking at all these images for a second. Well, black people, I'm like, wow, this is very interesting. It is. If you've never been, it's quite black. All these wonderful adverts. So long story short, one of that, and I think that's quite interesting because it's what, of course, it's instructional, right? Not only is it selling to certain communities and constituencies, but it's also the imagining of the colonial government to say, what do we want our place to actually look like, right? One scholar frames them as kind of like political rubrics for the kind of tourist society which is in the making, right? So, if we can really make the space look like this, and on the days that they actually do involve black folks, it's black folks bringing the margarita, bringing the rum punch, bringing the rum swizzle, etc., or whatever. Pick an island, pick a different trip, right? The repeatingness of this, the repetitive nature of this. But what's also interesting is, once again, too, is this is kind of marking social relations, and it's marking scripts of how people should behave, who's a guest, who's a host. It's codifying behavior. It's instructional. I had a student, appreciate them all day, because even in terms of how this continues, and of course this project doesn't go into that, but I just think, just as a side note, it's interesting that a number of islands from Bermuda now, as well as a number of other Caribbean islands, also circulate videos or pamphlets which tell you how to relate to the tourists. You need to smile. You need to say good morning. If the tourist asks you for directions, you don't send them. Because when we were small, we used to send them. Like, I mean, you guys probably don't do that, so we used to send them. Like, if the beach was that way, and then up the hill, and they would ask me where the beach is, like, oh, it's that way, and you got to turn left at the greenhouse. And we try and send them in the wood, like, you know, so they get around. Forgive me, that's why I'm a professor, right? Right on my evil ways. But what's my point? I'm trying to come back to a bigger point. The bigger point is this, right? These are kind of instructional documents as much as they are commercial documents, right? They're expressing a desire. They're expressing a desire. And one of the things that we need to think about is this desire is partly mapped out in reality. At least partly, yeah? As well as by the segregating of labor. What opportunities can you get in that space to even break out of these patterns that they've kind of instructed or at least imagined? So bearing that in mind, right? The thing that we need to think about is this. The presence of tourists that were black within this specific kind of racial context was puzzling. Because from a socioeconomic point of view, black tourists were often suitable potential consumers. Althea Gibson, she's maybe not a millionaire by this point, but she is pretty well off as a black woman traveling around making a living by playing professional tennis in the 1950s. She's doing all right. Maybe not Serena money and Venus money yet, but she's doing all right. So therefore, from a sheerly socioeconomic gaze or point of view, we can think about black tourists as being quite suitable potential consumers. But since the barriers of race determined who could or who could not enjoy the pleasures of this British colonial paradise, black tourists were often treated as undesirable interlopers. Adding another complicated layer to the problem of race and recreation was the business agendas of entrepreneurs seeking to attract more black tourists to the island. To some, this looks like a bad idea. You're lining someone up for trouble and lining yourself up for problems. Why? Because this is a space where the dominant racial logics are what? Whites only and white tourists only. Therefore, however, upon closer examination of black tourism entrepreneurs, and by black tourism entrepreneurs, I just referenced that a lot, and that's thinking about folks who are black who are travel agents, hotel owners, folks who own guest houses. I guess here in the United States they would be referred to as B&Bs, bed and breakfast types of locations, those who own restaurants, those who own pubs and nightclubs and so forth. Black folks who have these spaces which are unsegregated, as well as taxi drivers, tour operators, and musicians, and the whole life. It's interesting because when we think about them, we've got to think about how their interests, as well as their agendas, might intersect in ways that enable both recreation for black visitors, but also resistance for black communities. So they're kind of meeting on these business interests in ways that provide an opportunity for them to push back against this segregation, but also at the same time earn some type of money from providing leisure. What I want to think about is this. I want us to think about it over the next couple of slides as I run through these things. Is that black tourism entrepreneurs, on one hand, are service-oriented. On one hand, they're service-oriented. They express a kind of legitimate desire to make some type of commercial income from providing holiday-making amenities for blacks, as well as Jews, as well as other racial communities such as Asians who are often excluded by these hotels because Jews factor in this in some interesting ways, particularly in the 30s and 40s and early 40s. However, on the other side of their their service orientation is also self-interest. And this self-interest includes desires to inhabit certain spaces of recreation and consume many of the island's attractions that have been reserved for tourists and white islanders. In order to get at this, I think we might have an opportunity or should take a closer look at the actual activities of the travel agent who was instrumental in bringing Althea Gibson to the island, a man by the name of Hilton Gray-Lee. When we look at the business practices and broader political aspirations of the island's black tourism entrepreneurs, we can see a number of these ideas being demonstrated. Hill's firm, Bermuda Vacation Travel Services, was opened up in 1949. He utilized the same office space that he had used at one time to run his commercial photography studio. But before opening his agency, Hill had been drawn into the travel business by a representative of Colonial Airlines, who had hired him to sell tickets part-time for the airline. This was a pretty common practice in Bermuda as well as some other smaller Caribbean islands, which did not have a dedicated airport space for selling tickets and whatnot. Oftentimes, airline tickets as well as steamer tickets would be sold out of the offices of other retailers. So you can go to the general store and pick up some deals, pick up some stocks, as well as a ticket on the Cunard or some other vessel. Therefore, what we do notice is this. He has a belief that opening up a travel agency after a few months of selling tickets for Colonial Airlines would be a lucrative venture. However, it's based on more than intuition. I think it's based on his own experiences that showed him a latent commercial opportunity that lie at the nexus of race and travel. One of the things we need to know about Hill is he's the scion of a well-off black businessman. His father had actually been one of those few land-owning blacks who had been able to get elected to the House of Assembly back in the 20s. So he's pretty well off land-wise. Even though his father dies before he ends up going off to live in the United States, he's still pretty well set in comparison to many of his black Bermudian counterparts. In the late 1930s, he's sent off to study at Boston University, where he majors in English. During his college years, Hill becomes involved in Boston's Bermuda Overseas Club, a local organization that assisted Bermudian immigrants and students in making the transition to life in America by providing a range of settlement services, as well as hosting parties, that's the fun stuff, and sporting events and other social gatherings. Club activities placed Hill in contact with the city's Bermudians, as well as members of Boston's Caribbean community. Meanwhile, campus life allowed him to interact with whites and African-American classmates. In addition, Hill pledged Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. And this Greek-led organization would benefit him greatly because he remained an active member even after he returned to Bermuda. Most significantly, though, Hill met his future wife, Ms. Georgine Russell, a student at the Massachusetts College of Art and a member of Boston's African-American upper class. Her father was, in fact, a contemporary of Monroe Trotter, and her mother was like a concert pianist and very well-to-do hoity-toity folks. As a result, these two, an upper-class, light-skinned, pretty well-off black Bermudian, marries another upper-class, light-skinned African-American. And they attempt to make it work in their marriage in 1940. However, shortly after being married in 1940, the couple relocate to New York, where Hilton studies photography at the New York Institute of Photography. The couple returned to Bermuda in 1941 at the completion of his program, and that's just a few months before the United States ended up entering into the war. During his years in Boston, as well as later in New York, Hill became acquainted with the racial geography of both these cities, particularly where black travelers lodged, the neighborhoods where African Americans and Afro-Caribbean islanders reside, their respective leisure venues, as well as their churches and other things which were important to the ways in which they made life in America. In addition, Hill's African-American fraternity brothers, not to mention his in-laws and many of Georgine's friends, were constantly expressing a desire to visit Bermuda. And he was constantly having to share the difficulties of segregation. So even before he began to sell the first ticket for Colonial Airlines, Hill was keenly aware of a potential market of African Americans that wanted to visit Bermuda, as well as an experiential understanding of black travel patterns in Boston, New York, as well as the East Coast of the United States generally. Realizing that the context of segregation in Bermuda presented black visitors with a range of potential hazards, Hill developed Bermuda Vacation Travel Service to meet the needs of black travelers moving through segregated white space. Yet Hill's proficiency as a travel agent would be useless if there was not already a network of unsegregated black-owned hotels, guest houses, nightclubs, and entertainments for tourists to enjoy. Lillian Myers steps on the scene as a guest house owner and an avid promoter of Bermuda. She would become a mentor to Hill during his early years in the travel business and remained a stalwart of black tourism until her death. One of the things, this is an ad from the local newspaper, and one of the things that we see quite early, from 1951, quite early with Hill is not only is he thinking about travel from African Americans coming into the island, but he's also seeking how do we have the other side of this. So even the promotion of leisure to what? Black spaces. This is a fight between, for those who don't know, Sugar Ray Robinson You know, Randy Turpin, they ended up fighting in New York. So even as he's figuring out how do I get more African-American tourists to this island of Bermuda, he's also trying to say, how do I get some of these black Bermudians who want to enjoy leisure, who want to enjoy some type of sophisticated or some feeling of eliteness, because we understand that travel is a commodity. How do I kind of push this on my fellow upper-class black Bermudians? And one of the things he does is he starts to embark on traveling to sporting events. So not only is it the boxing event there in New York for Sugar Ray Robinson, it's also, you see him promoting the national tennis tournament at Wilberforce, Ohio. So even putting him in spaces around black college students, and even once again too, this is another space where we'll start to see, or even see some more of the black upper class attending some of the schools and sites where they actually travel to. So even the ways in which this thing of travel, even though it's just being put forth as a kind of leisure activity, it does bear some type of fruit in terms of education and even in terms of pastimes that black communities become involved in. But focusing our mind on our good friend, Miss Lillian Miners. Lillian Miners was married to a man by the name of Archibald and who worked in the printing business. During the early 1930s, they had spent some time living in Harlem, New York, with Lillian's sister. Lillian had actually gone up there in order to study beauty and hairdressing. So she was going to beauty school and learning how to fix hair and all the rest of it. And Archie managed to get himself a job in the printing business. And they lived, and while they lived in Harlem, they frequented Abyssinian Baptist Church, where they met several members who, of course, wanted to know more about their island home, and they enjoyed their life while they were there in Harlem. However, before their return in 1939, Lillian hatched the idea of opening some type of hotel or guest house when she returned to Bermuda. Archibald wasn't too sold on the idea. However, once they got back to the island, after discussing it during the kind of war period, he became closer and closer interested in the idea. They purchased a home in St. George's in the early 40s and worked on the home, adding extra rooms to it so that it could eventually accommodate 14 guests. However, running the guest house eventually became Lillian's domain. As Archie remarked during an interview about their experience, he said, "Man, that part was all my wife's doing. That was all her idea." But it turned out to be quite a lucrative idea, because as soon as they got the house fixed up and the war concluded, Lillian began writing off letters to her church friends at Abyssinia, as well as the number of her Harlem acquaintances. However, what she found was the reply to these letters were quite slow, and a friend of hers at Abyssinia mentioned to her, "Girl, it makes more sense for you to just come up here and just do a meeting after church." She thought about it, and thought about it some more, and eventually that's exactly what she ended up doing. Lillian acted on this suggestion, and she compiled a number of photographs as well as slides about Bermuda into a formal presentation designed to promote the island as well as sell their brand new guest house, which they called Archland Villa. Lillian began her promotional tours with visits to Abyssinia Baptist Church in the 1940s after the war, and her presentation itinerary was supplemented by invitations to visit other churches. In other words, once she got to Abyssinia and folks got very impressed with the things that she was sharing, those folks told their other friends who went to other churches, and the word kind of spread by word of mouth. Interesting. Social networks. Before electronic media. Wow. Wow, that's pretty good. Nonetheless, with regards to her promotional activity, she says this thing. She has this really interesting quote, which I thought was quite funny. She says, "The idea of promotions, I called it a safari. It was my safari. At that time, the Trade Development Board, that's the former colonial board which was in charge of the island's tourism, they weren't sending any safaris abroad. I came up with it. The safari, that's mine." Well, we're going to leave the kind of colonialist and the kind of anti-rhino, kill the rhinos, kill the elephants language out the door for a little minute, but just let that drop on the ground. Maybe you can ask a question about that later, but I'm not pretending to be an expert in it, or her choice of words. But I think it's an interesting choice of words, right? She's considering herself a bit of a big game hunter, right? Of what? Like black folks with money to come and spend in Bermuda. Interesting. And she also sees herself as a kind of pioneer in this practice, even at a moment when the colonial government, who's getting paid quite well, to promote tourism still hasn't brought up the idea that she's thought of. Interesting. Black women not yet in the level for stuff they invent. Interesting. In addition to a promotional safaris, Minus contacted the Victor H. Green Company in 1948 in order to place an advert for Austin Villa in the 1949 edition of the Negro Motorist Green Book, an international travel guide. USA, Alaska, Bermuda, Mexico, and Canada. The Negro Motorist was established in 1936 for the purpose of giving the Negro traveler information that will keep him from running into difficulties and embarrassments and make his trips more enjoyable. Those were some interesting euphemisms for keep yourself alive in the South. The Negro Motorist Green Book was one of the many publications in a larger genre of Negro travel guides established during the era of segregation that of course included Travel Guide, Cook's Negro Travel Guide, Grayson's Guide, Hankey and Harrison's Hotel and Apartment Guide, and the Negro Traveler. Lillian's promotional tours paid off with the first guests arriving after the end of the war, and the groups consisted of mostly members of the Abyssinian Baptist Church. When recalling, however, the challenges of constructing a tour itinerary in a segregated island, Mrs. Minus' response articulated the service-oriented dynamics of Black tourism. She stated that, I took them around. I showed them where to go. I used to take them sightseeing. They wanted to go on boat rides too, but they couldn't go on them other boats. So I organized my own boat ride. I hired a boat. I would fix lunch. I fixed rum swizzles. I saw to it the days boy Bermuda. The service-oriented characteristics of Black entrepreneurs obscures a fundamental injustice that no amount of island hospitality or love from Miss Minus could ever overcome. And that was the fact that Black Islanders, as more than 60% of the population, were actively subsidizing the development, maintenance, and promotion of hotels, attractions, and tourist infrastructure that they, nor their Black guests, could ever utilize. Meanwhile, white Bermudians, whose circumstantial pigmentation granted them the esteemed status of honorary tourist for life, were granted access to spaces of leisure underwritten by Black taxes as well as Black laborers. This inequity, alongside the burden of daily innovation needed to make a way for their African American guests in the face of a segregated tourist attractions, fueled the self-interested desires of Black Islanders. You see, how could you not think about these infrastructures and not at some point think about or even long to have free access and consume at the sites which their taxes supply? Indeed, Black entrepreneurs would have to wait many more years, though, before the tourism business was subsidized equally by the colonial government, or even subsidized at all. Until that time, people like Theo and others took note of Lillian Minus's methods. Hilton Hill engaged the African American press as well as a promotional tour in his quest for Black tourist dollars. In 1949, shortly after beginning his business, Hill invited David Hepburn, the executive editor of Our World magazine, to Bermuda for a late summer vacation in exchange for a promotional article about Bermuda and his travel agency. The resulting article, Bermuda Holiday, was published in January 1950, and it revealed the politics of Black tourism as well as the aspirations of Black tourism entrepreneurs. Firstly, before we go too far in it, the article reproduced many of the tropes used by the white segregated mainstream, but also central to most forms of tourism. In other words, it plays up the paradise-ish nature of Bermuda. It doesn't necessarily use the slogans that the Trade Development Board had manufactured. However, it mimics largely the themes of Pleasure Island and an Atlantic playground. The Trade Development Board had been using these themes of Pleasure Island or an Atlantic playground since about the 1920s when they did a massive renovation of tourism in Bermuda following World War I. and they managed to seize over 500 acres from a black community without full pay, eminent domain, and other kinds of interesting things played out in that situation. However, they seized all of this land in order to create golf courses, beachfront chateaus for sale for rich American and Canadian tourist investors, as well as making the island, or at least certain realms of the island, into play spaces, kind of like your contained sandals resorts is kind of popular now in the 21st century. However, however, they did not actually utilize the same language, but they played up on some of these ideas. As well, they highlighted the class exclusivity of Bermuda by engaging a bunch of class-conscious name-dropping and occupation. Well, what do I mean? In other words, many of the men and women who are featured in these images, such as this wakeboarding image, which formed the kind of opening spread of the actual article, were friends and peers of Hilton Head, meaning that they were landowners, many of them. Some of them were lawyers. Some of them worked in white-collar occupations. As a result, when they would mention them, they would say, well, you know, the editor of the newspaper, the Bermuda Recorder, is pictured here with his wife. She is a member of Delta Sigma Theta sorority. This other person is one of Bermuda's very first black lawyers, etc., etc. Therefore, the ways in which they described the folks who were consuming tourism read very similar to the ways in which the white tourist industry oftentimes tried to promote their own tourism. However, what's interesting too, though, is we can understand that this would probably signal, though, to what? Certain classes of African Americans, right? You know, then the African Americans who go on vacation in Martha's Vineyard might be like, oh yeah, I want a vacation somewhere sunny, and they have black lawyers I can have a drink with. Quite nice. So, interesting, but also kind of problematic, right? Also, too, another element which is kind of ringing in the background of this whole discussion is that Hill is possibly thinking about maintaining the classism or the class elitism of black tourism might help to allay the fears of white colonial authorities who felt that marketing black tourism would attract the wrong type of visitors. In addition, not just racially, but even from this whole notion of which class of black folks are visiting this space, which oftentimes turned out to be an interesting and a lengthy dialogue when Hill and others got behind closed doors. So we've got these two kind of ideas going on at the same time. You see up there on the slide, we've got politics of representation, but you've also got politics of representation. Of course, the representation is what these actual black Bermudians embodied as what? Consumers of the tourist lifestyle. Something which either they had been completely whitewashed, quite literally, out of the picture of mainstream tourism advertising. They're starting to insert themselves quite literally into these spaces. But you also have a kind of representation of Bermuda, because guess what? The narrative of Bermuda being a segregated space, the narrative of Bermuda being a racist space, the narrative of black folks not being welcome is already out there. And he started contending with that discourse. In fact, that's part of the reason why he invites Hepburn there and our world there in the first place. Thus, what you see here is another advert that he runs in the New York Amsterdam newspaper, probably a few months after the Our World article makes its circulation. And of course, what do we see? We say, vacation in Bermuda, race policy improved. What's crazy is this is about a year before Althea Gibson gets Jim Crow at the tennis stadium. Come on, Hilton. But we're not mad at him. Why? Because he's kind of trying to repackage this space. He's trying to rebrand this space. And part of the work that he's engaged in is largely some of the work which white tourism promoters got engaged in when they first initiated tourism. What was Bermuda when they started? Onion patch. Who wants to go there? It's going to smell like onions, and you can see dudes like Dr. Francis walk around with no shoes on. Not sexy. We've got to rebrand this. Who's going to buy that? Thus and therefore, they had to represent Bermuda and making up or drawing on all these kind of early turn-of-the-century notions of paradise, turn-of-the-century notions of what British beauty was. They had to represent Bermuda from what it actually was, into this kind of imagined constellation that they believed would appeal to certain white consumers in the United States in particular. Likewise, Hill is engaged in some of the similar kind of work. However, like we said, this work isn't taking place in a vacuum. It's not taking place in a vacuum. And part of the work that they had to engage was these negative types of associations with Bermuda by reason of things that actually happened. It's interesting though, because even in this article in Our World magazine, 1950, that Hill commissions to promote a positive spin on Bermuda. The author of the article, David Hepburn, he couldn't sidestep the issue of segregation. Man, I got 7 pages up here to eat up, man. I just can't put pictures all the time. So he includes a little touch on the hem of the garment of segregation. I just want to read a quick little excerpt from it. He says, even though the work of Our World was meant to be this kind of recuperative project for Bermuda's image around race, Hepburn couldn't help but talking about it. He said there are 2 unpleasant aspects on the island of Bermuda. One is the midnight curfew. The other is more serious, and that is Jim Crow. Although a fringe of professional Negroes live in sumptuous indifference, the mass of the island's 22,000 colored are completely subjugated by its 12,000 whites. On the pretext that it would hurt their tourist trade, the large hotels are color tight. What's more, blacks in Bermuda have no redress because there are no civil rights laws. He draws very keen attention, and you can tell that's through a number of diaspora dialogues or conversations with black Bermudians. He's actually begun to understand how segregation operates in Bermuda and how the British color line, British Caribbean color line, is looking a little distinct from the North American color line. Our World drew attention, of course, to Bermuda's white supremacy while offering, of course, a backhanded critique to the apathetic nature of some members of the black Bermudian upper class. And the fact that Bermuda had already gained a reputation throughout the African diaspora for its racism by the early 20th century was in part what made the promotional feature necessary in the first place. And even though Hepburn couldn't ignore the color line, he attempted to allay the concerns of most black readers by claiming, he says, but all these things I've said, that shouldn't affect your holiday. Most whites are non-committal, if not respectful. And if there's any comfort for you, just know that there isn't a magnolia tree on any of the 365 islands. You're not making me feel safe from this. No, I'm not. But even just the kind of interesting note that he makes a reference towards, even though Bermuda has this kind of very rigid color line in operation, he said, well, you know, the levels of racial violence are quite different. If you mess up, you'll just get shouted at or cussed out, maybe getting a ticket, but you won't be strung up. How interesting. How interesting. As a result, one of the things we can see is the attempt to promote black tourism and the attempt to represent Bermuda is running up against this politics of desegregation. And I say it's rubbing up against it because, in part, it's an outgrowth of black tourism to the island. What do I mean? I mean African Americans as well as blacks from other Caribbean territories. Whenever they came to Bermuda, or many times when they came to Bermuda, and if they had a negative experience around race, guess what? They expressed it through the black press. And just, you know, side note from methodology types of things, this was one of those interesting spaces where I would have interviews with elders. They tell me a bunch of fun stuff, and then I'd end up combing through the newspaper. Oh, that's what that means, right? Oh, now I know whose name to look for when I'm combing through like days and days and days and days and days and days of newspapers. So just on a methodological note, that was some of the ways in which I kind of came back to this. Anyway, one of the things we're talking about is what? This politics of desegregation, which is wrapped up in black travel to Bermuda. Such is the case, for example, with Mr. A.M. Wendell Mallet. He visited Bermuda in late June 1946. And after he visited Bermuda, he penned the wonderful article which you see headlined there, Negroes' Plight on British Island is as bad as Alabama. I mean, Alabama? Y'all were here? Well, maybe it's because I'm Bermudian. I was in my feelings, man. I was in my feelings. Like, Alabama? That's Scottsboro boys, man. Come on, man. Alabama? But it's interesting too, because Melliot is apparently, like, he's Jamaican and lives there in New York, so even, you know, this kind of background, is this Caribbean island this, and I'm not sure how to take this. Because we love to talk about each other when we're not. And Jamaicans in the room, real quick before I roast down. Oh man, okay, well, I'll just keep on my notes. Keep on my notes. But Alabama? Interesting, right? This kind of comparative read, right, across the diaspora of who's free and who ain't. Who's oppressed and who ain't. Side note, it's kind of relative. Side note. I'm coming back. One of the interviews I did was with former statesman in Bermuda, a man by the name of Mr. Woolridge, right? And he was legendary cricketer, you know, great politician, at one time was like supposed to be, you know, becoming the premier of the island, or it was like second in command to become just under the governor. So he's one of those guys, right? He also commentates on the radio. So if you know about Caribbean culture, we love listening to radios all day long. And talk show people just all craziness on the radio, especially about cricket or something we really like. Oh my goodness, you become that guy, right? So I'm interviewing that guy. He's 80-something years old, and he's just telling me about everything I don't know. And looking at me stupid every time I ask questions that he thinks are ridiculous, right? But anyway, I'm getting at him about all of these questions of segregation. I'm like, but I mean, you know, Mr. Woolridge, how do they feel about the color line and, you know, segregation, Mr. Woolridge? He's like, huh? Huh? I quote, Christ, we was freer than them. I was like, huh? What's that, huh? Huh? So it's a very interesting moment of how people even read their own kind of space of freedom, right? And because he felt that, guess what, Bermuda was absent or lacked that notion of lynching, or this kind of very harsh line of racial terror expressed through wanton white violence, he just felt, hey, you know, he was freer than him, even though he had segregation. So what you talking to me about, young boy? Can I come back tomorrow? So this kind of interesting diasporic read. So one of the things we see is this. Mallet castigates the island. He roasts it from top to bottom. He talks about the segregated schools. He talks about the absence of full franchise, meaning he talks about this land-only thing in order to vote. He rips apart the notion of tourism and calls tourism very racist. He goes in on Bermuda. Likewise, James Earl, who's there on the Bermuda is nice, but only if you're white category. He picks up on this notion of, guess what? You know, hey, if you're white and a tourist, everything's good for you. And he castigates British rule. He goes in on the British and he says, under the Union Jack, this shouldn't be happening. And he has these ideas around British fair play. And he rips into Bermuda about having segregation and how wrong it is in the context of British fair play. What's the point, Doc? My point is simply this. All of these articles, and there are many more, and it's kind of interesting to read and have a little chuckle at how badly these guys go in on Bermuda. But they're all critiques going a certain way. They're not just describing it, but they're critiquing to say this needs to change. The other thing they're introducing too is ideas of diaspora. Ideas of diaspora. They're saying that, guess what, in particular, Malliot says, you know, these Bermudians are doing worse than some of our brothers in the South. And we need to help them, this kind of reaching out notion, even if it's just rhetorical. It's these constructs of seeing black Bermudians as having something in common with African Americans at an interesting level. And one of the things we see this is also echoed in Bermuda. Or maybe it started in Bermuda, I'm not quite sure. Well, what's interesting is this. We remember that the incident with Althea Gibson takes place in July 51. About a month later, we see David Tucker. He's a lawyer, as well as the editor of the Bermuda Recorder, the island, at this time, the island's only black newspaper. He writes the following. He writes an editorial known as The Franchise and Segregation. The Franchise and Segregation. And it's all dripping with these notions of, for one, breaking down or deconstructing this idea of what the franchise does not allow black communities to do, or the landed franchise. But it's also wrapped up in these notions of black trafficking. It's littered with these ideas of black trafficking. He says, because of our political impotence, we can be insulted with impunity, and colored tourists can be made to be humiliated and embarrassed. We must work hard for the day when colored tourists, whose money is the same as any other tourist, can work to the point where all of us can enjoy those rights and privileges which are the birthright of all British subjects and American citizens. So he's making this kind of connection between the civil rights struggle of Bermuda and the ongoing civil rights battles which are unfolding in the United States. A kind of diasporic read of civil rights politics at this moment, in the moment that it's taking place. It's also interesting on another level too, because this appeal, he's writing in a black newspaper, so we know it probably sells to black folks, like, oh yeah, interesting. But it's also an appeal which might have more luck than what they've tried previously, when they've simply complained about racism to the white overlords of the island. He's actually framing segregation in these issues as a problem of what? A problem of commerce, a problem of business. He says, excuse me, I'm also messing with your construction of tourists as being white only. Guess what? These folks come here on a plane or on a ship, they spend money, they do all the other things, they want to go on tours just like all the other things those other category folks do. And if you don't see to their needs in the proper way, guess what? This might prove to be a commercial loss for you. So reframing this whole segregation problem as a problem of commerce that's centered around black travel is very provocative and interesting, especially since it comes out of Bermudians, not imported in. Another interesting letter from David Tucker as well, too, in 1951. It's probably about a week after the other one. And once again, too, this time he's looking at more so what the kind of social fraternity amongst what? Black Bermudians and African Americans. He's looking at these moments of social fraternity. And one of the things, too, which is important to recognize, too, is this notion that at this moment, Black Bermudians lack the kind of formalized tourist infrastructure. They're doing like what? They're doing like Mrs. Miners, right? I had to take them, they can't go on those boat rides, so I had to hire my friend who's got a boat. Oh, they couldn't go there. So guess what? African Americans are largely doing what? Like they're kind of doing a lot of Airbnb, right? They're rolling with locals. They're going drinking where I go drink or used to go drink, right? They're going to eat where I go eat, not the bona fide, certified, SAG-rated tourist spots. Interesting. So this whole conversation, one tourist theorist talks about front stage, backstage, right? It's a little problematic, and we can disrupt that a bit if we want. But to use the lingo, they're actually being invited into more backstage spaces. More backstage spaces, therefore they get a bit more of a, once again, problematic language, but I just don't have a good word for it off the top of my head. More authentic, and somebody can check me on that later. I'll give you something better. But a more authentic read on what black life looks like. It's less packaged. As a result of them actually having to live with black people in their guest house. Roll with black people to the places where they go to frequent. Thus and therefore, he's raising these issues. The other thing too is it's a jab at segregationists. He says we need to make them feel welcome. Yes, of course, the black we, but also the collective we, the Bermuda we. We need to make them feel welcome so that they will not only return to us, but they will also tell their friends and thereby help all of us. What is this once again, this economic greed, this commercial greed, or trying to tack the issue of desegregation, or trying to tack the issues of civil rights progress to a commercial issue. As we close. What we can see, as we said earlier, is these ideas of representation. these ideas of commerce, segregation as a commercial issue, politics of diaspora as well as the politics of desegregation. All of that manifests itself in the event of desegregation or the 10th state. Grassroots organizing. It's a letter writing campaign. Immediately after Althea Gibson experiences that Jim Crow incident where she gets kind of forced out of the tennis stadium, these men go and complain to the Lawn Tennis Association, or the Lawn Tennis Club, rather. They don't want to hear it, so they start a letter writing campaign. They get rejected on their request to desegregate the stadium. In 1953, Hilton Hill, that black travel agent, he gets elected to colonial office, and he leads the charge on the very first race relations parliamentary committee. He leads the charge on that. He's joined by Russell Pierman. His wife owns a guest house, and they are frequent operators and frequently taking African Americans around on tour. He's also joined by a black lawyer from Guyana named E.T. Richards, who also is what? One of the branch presidents of the Imperial, well, the branch president of the Imperial Hotel, the hotel where Althea Gibson and her friends stayed. So the lead on this issue, particularly this issue to desegregate the stadium by 1955, was taken largely by what? An incident that got started with black tourism. An incident which got started around black tourism. And the leadership came from men in the black tourism business. So as we hasten to a close, what we need to recognize is this shows us a number of interesting things, or at least I think it shows us a number of interesting facts. One, it caused me to rethink the nature of intra-racial relations between African Americans and Caribbean Islanders. In my Caribbean history class, I got a few of my students here appreciate them for showing up and supporting. Thank you. We're reading an interesting article about, the tense relationships between what? Caribbean Islanders and what? African Americans, primarily in the region of New York, right? So this is causing me to rethink, and I said, wow, how does it look? How do those relationships, which we try to kind of map across, and just say, black American and black Caribbean don't get along. Latino areas say don't get along. How do we kind of rethink this, or at least how do we complicate this, especially when we step outside of the United States space? What does this look like? Interesting. Causes us to rethink these ideas of black internationalism. What does the freedom struggle look like, and how is it articulated in different spaces, especially when it seems like civil rights activism seems to be an unintended consequence? Folks did not show up to write a bunch of letters and fuss at the tennis stadium and get it desegregated. They showed up to watch a tennis tournament. Oh, yeah, give us a girl. Go. We showed up to get into recreation, but interestingly enough, along the way, it's a moment for what? Organization. What does this tell us about black internationalism? How are black folks getting together? And what does it tell us about the liberatory possibilities of black leisure travel? I think I've kind of spoken to that. How does leisure travel open up a space, sometimes intentional, sometimes unintended, for political work to take place? And last but not least, what does the black freedom movement, what does black civil rights look like when we take a diaspora? Not solely only focused on an African American perspective of one region of the United States, and for that matter, because oftentimes that history is largely told through the lens of the South, whatever that is, right? What happens when we open up these lenses and look at different issues? So therefore, what we need to remember about Bermuda is that segregation in Bermuda would not end until legislation was passed against it, and the island's constitution was changed in the late 1960s. Even as those legal transitions took place, African Americans, in fact a couple of tourists, played critical roles in these legal developments. Yet this moment of racial victory transpired, yet until this moment of racial victory transpired, white islanders, black Bermudians, and African American tourists who find themselves trapped in the triangle of tourism, between the pink white sands, the crystal blue sea, and the struggle for civil